Okay. God, today help me set aside everything I think I know about you, everything I think I know about myself, everything I think I know about others, and everything I think I know about my own recovery. So I may have an open mind and a new experience of all these things. Please help me see the truth. Amen. So I'm going to put this on speaker mode. We can, Paul, you got to unmute. I got to mute. See Paul here. Okay, we're all set. So special speaker tonight is my dad, which I'm so pumped about. Dad, thanks for being here. This is so cool for me anyways. So Dad's going to talk. Dad's, if you read my extensive introduction, Dad's been involved in social justice his whole life. But tonight, probably in honor of Black History Month, we're going to talk about particularly his experiences in Mississippi. So before we get to that, Dad, if you could just talk a little bit about your faith, and how your faith brought you to Mississippi.
Well, I had an unusual degree of almost immersion in Quakerism. I grew up in a family where both my father and my mother were descended from the earliest stage at which there were Quakers, and the forebears on both sides came into the then colonies in the 1600s. So there was a long heritage. Some very notable aspects of that, as Tom noted in one of his overly generous backgrounds, a direct antecedent, Timothy Matlack, was the one who wrote out the Declaration of Independence at the Continental Congress. I grew up in a town that had been founded by Quakers, went to a Quaker meeting that had 200, 250 people every Sunday, and that is not what most Quaker meetings have for their attendance these days. A Quaker school that was attached, were kindergarten to 10th grade. I went to Morristown Friends School in New Jersey, and then graduated from a Quaker boarding school back of Philadelphia, where I met my wife, and again, where my family had been going for several generations. I think I had models in the meeting and in the school of Quakers that I admired. And I had a sense, I think, of there's a legacy there that I need to honor, that I need to find ways to live out my Quaker values. And from a very early stage, was very focused on current events, political activity. What can be done to work in the contemporary setting that makes Quaker witness effective in looking for justice, and on a larger scale, when there were wars and external violence, to be part effectively of peace movements working against large-scale war. That background all prepared me to be very interested in what became the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I graduated from Princeton in 1960, and the next 2 years I was in Oxford, England, earning an MA. So I missed the beginnings of the civil rights movement. And when I got back, 62, went to Yale for 5 years to get a PhD. There was a sense of wanting to get involved, to catch up, because this new civil rights struggle, and Martin Luther King was beginning to be seen as a major leader, was working with remarkable success and commitment on the basis of a nonviolent civil disobedience model that was Quaker and its practice, and religiously led at that stage especially. And that just seemed ready-made for something that I needed to be involved in as best I could. So it was no surprise that at Yale, the chaplain at Yale was Reverend William Sloane Coffin, who was then and through that decade a major voice nationally for civil rights and for peace advocacy in the context of the Vietnam War. But he had an influence in terms of being active in creating some program situations that I took advantage of. And the first of those that took me to Mississippi was in 1963, when I think it was Al Lowenstein, if that's a name that anybody remembers, had come up and talked to Bill about helping to get some volunteers from Yale to go down to Mississippi, where the early stages of trying to work for voter registration were getting organized. And they felt that if there were Northerners involved, it might offer protection to the local activists who otherwise would be very vulnerable to reprisal. And Bill called a meeting with some discussion and so on. And then a bunch of us from Yale went down to Mississippi in the fall of '63. I went down with one of my Princeton roommates who was then in Yale Divinity School. One of his classmates lived in Memphis and was driving down and would take us to Mississippi. So the three of us went for, I don't know, 30 hours or something, taking turns sleeping in the backseat of a Volkswagen Bug to get to Tupelo, Mississippi, and spent 10 days accompanying local Black activists as they began the early stages of the voter registration effort. And it was an immersion in what soon became clear was a volatile, potentially dangerous situation in which the Black community was under occupation, you might say. There was separation, there was segregation, and then anybody who was trying to make a serious change was under threat of violence and repression. I didn't do any direct, interviewing people at the doors of their cottage, their humble homes or whatever to try to get them to sign up. I was simply a witness, a bystander, vouching for this process. The fellow I was going around with had a car, but as a signal of how the conditions were set at the time, he said, "You got to be in the back seat. If you're in the front seat alongside me, they're going to stop us. And the last thing you want is to have the local police stop this car."
Because he was African-American, right then?
Yeah. Oh, it was all Black. We stayed in Black households, the Black community. The whole effort was on the African-American community. And so we never got into serious trouble, but you're always in this strange sense of what might happen and kind of a tension. At the same time, you were watching people being approached to say, look, we want you to sign this parallel registration. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was set up as a parallel structure to the regular Democratic Party that wasn't taking Blacks in at all. And so few were registered anyway at that point. This is '63 still. So sometimes you saw remarkable courage. Other times you saw people who just wouldn't talk to the young activists at the door because it was too dangerous. The stakes were very high. Well, 10 days of that was a taste of the immersion in that conflicted and struggle situation. How we were ever going to get those Blacks properly registered to actually vote in the regular elections seemed very remote. Well, at the end of the 10 days, the guy who'd driven us down went home to Memphis. He was not going back to New Haven. So Mel and I called down to the headquarters at that point for the civil rights effort. Stokely Carmichael was the lead figure at the time. And I explained the situation. We needed to ride back to New Haven. He said, well, there is a fellow who's working in the southern part of Mississippi from Yale, and I'm pretty sure he's driving back, but he won't come up through Tupelo. You'll have to get over to the town where the University of Alabama is.
Athens. Oh, no, Tuscaloosa.
Tuscaloosa, I'm blocking it, yeah. So Mel and I took a bus, an interstate bus, but it was still segregated. And to make a statement, we sat in the back and got no controversy, particularly just curiosity at that. Got to Tuscaloosa, got a boarding house and spent the night, and went to the bus station waiting for our pickup ride. Bus station had a nice large waiting room with a lot of glass so you could see the street, see when the bus would pull up and so on. And we were there toward a half an hour, and I realized there was not a single black face in that room. And I said, there's something's going on here. And the waiting room was adjacent to a large garage where all the buses were gassed up and worked on, and it was full of fumes and exhaust in that space. But I went through the door into the garage part and looked down the wall, and sure enough, the colored waiting room was in a closed room, no windows, nothing but some light bulbs overhead, breathing all that exhaust stuff. That's where blacks had to wait to get a bus ride out of Tuscaloosa in 1960.
So who drove you back, Dad?
What?
So who drove you?
I'm getting there.
Okay.
So we had to face again a decision. Do we rest in the comfortable waiting room with the whites? We go to the blacks, but then we won't see when our ride comes because they're not going to announce that. So the answer to that was we went out and stood on the street for an hour, and then the ride came through. As Tom is anticipating, the Yale senior who picked us up, we had a lot of time to talk before we got to New Haven. He was going to graduate, go to Yale Law School, get involved in Connecticut politics. And he did. He was elected state attorney general, and then he was elected to the US Senate. Joe Lieberman.
So let's talk about 64, Dad. So what was your official reason for going to Holly Springs?
Well, I was eager to go back, having had the initial experience. And again, Bill Coffin and Yale organized a program that made that possible. The major effort, so-called Freedom Summer effort, was taking mostly white grad students, some teachers, some lawyers, and others, up to 1,000 to go down and swamp the state with an effort at registration. I couldn't do that because when I said I want to go back to Mississippi in the summer, my wife Jean said, "You're not going without me." I spent 10 days wondering what was happening to you down there in the fall, and I'm not going to spend a whole summer wondering what's happening to you. If you go, I go. And so this Yale program provided a way to go back to Mississippi. It took faculty from the traditional Black colleges across the South, invited faculty doing summer programs to those to come north and study at Yale for the summer, when the white grad students would go south and teach those summer courses. The only traditional Black school in Mississippi was Rust College in Holly Springs, northern part of Mississippi. So I applied to go to Rust College, was accepted, and we were headed to Holly Springs for the full summer term situation. We traded our car from New Haven with my wife's parents' car, which had Maryland plates, was at least a border state. Thought that might have a little less provocation if we drove around, and drove down with 2-year-old William in a deck we built into the back of the Chevy, and Tom in utero. Jean was pregnant with Tom. We rolled into Rust College in Holly Springs. It's an established school set up by the Methodists after the Civil War, sort of fully functioning and probably struggling economically most of the time, but an ongoing institution. We were directed to a dorm on one side of the big sort of quadrangle open space of the campus. It's a 3-story brick building, and we were getting, I think, in a faculty apartment in the first floor of that building. And the young woman who was taking us to show us the room and tell us how to get set up, we brought a crib, so we had a crib for young William, and brought our stuff in. And she said, "Well, move the crib away from the window and just be cautious at night. We've had night riders come through and fire at the buildings from time to time." So that was the introduction to Rust College. Also in that first week, Mickey Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andy Goodman, quote, disappeared over in Philadelphia, Neshoba County. And I hope those are names that are known to you. The official position of the Mississippi, the newspapers and so on, was it's just a hoax, it's a fake, they're hiding somewhere. Every Black person we met and worked with knew to a certainty that they were gone. There was no doubt in their minds, and that was true. The bodies were found the last week of our time in Mississippi, where they had been buried after being arrested, released after dark from the jail, caught going out of town in a setup, and taken over and killed and buried. So that hung over the summer as part of the reality and the background of the violence. It's also true that various members of the volunteer group that came down, not so much our teacher group, we had 5 of us at Rust College, but the ones who were doing the day-to-day effort to register, and some of them were also then doing so-called freedom schools, teaching young Black kids some of the history that they wouldn't get in their regular schools. It was a very constructive effort at different parts of the state. But for the Black population mostly, and especially rurally, the Black church was the only safe place to hold meetings that was available to them. That had been true all the way back to the times of slavery. 64 Black churches were burned in Mississippi in the 2 years, 63, 64, as part of the resolution. It was a burned Black church that brought Schwerner and Chaney back from the Ohio training for the Freedom Summer Group, and they brought Andy Goodman with them. That's what brought them back to Philadelphia to get them arrested and killed. The teaching was tough. I was teaching an American history course. The students were almost all women who taught in the public schools and needed a credit to keep their credential up or something, and were woefully unequipped to cope with simple material. And I try to be fair. I don't want to be sort of too critical, but it was a sad commentary on the state of public education. No fault of their own, but boy, was that a challenge. I mean, in my other teaching in college years before I went to work for the Quakers in Washington, I always found the most difficult thing to do was how to tell someone who's written a poor paper how to make it a better paper, because you're not quite sure not to break their spirit, but to encourage them. In any event, the Freedom Summer Group had a large installation right on the edge of the Rust College campus. So we were in proximity. Because I had the car that we'd driven down in, I could help with transportation. I never did any of the actual interviewing, trying to get people to sign up. But there were, I don't know, 25 to 30 volunteers altogether in that site, and they worked in the counties around Marshall County as well as Marshall County. And I had occasion to take people out to run other errands that they needed a car for, and was aware of the uphill struggle sometimes to sort of get people willing to take the risk of signing this parallel document, the Freedom Democratic Party, but they got numbers over time. They gradually built that up. Because the regular party was so stridently lily white, especially under this pressure of this summer freedom contingent in the state, the stakes on trying to get anybody to actually go down and register in person were especially severe. There had been a lot of voting after the Civil War and the early Reconstruction, even in Mississippi. And then gradually, as the Southern conservatives whites reasserted their control, voters were purged until by 1890, there was almost no Black voting. And they wrote a law that said to register to vote, you had to satisfy the local registrar, who was a county official, the county courthouse, a satisfactory interpretation of any section of the state constitution, totally at the judgment of the registrar. So a total automatic veto for blacks if they chose, and they did most of the time choose that. So to build up a roster of blacks showing they did want to vote, this Freedom Democratic Party process was the sort of instrument, the way to indicate there was a very large population ready to vote.
So that, just
yeah.
just want to make sure we don't run out of time. So in terms of Freedom Democratic Party, so there were
Yeah.
county caucuses and then there was a
Yep.
state convention. So let's talk about
About to get there.
Okay.
One of the things that I could help with the car, the Freedom Democratic structure was going to parallel the regular structure in every way that it could. And so they had county meetings, and then they would have congressional district meetings, and then they have a statewide meeting. And you elect delegates to go on to the further meetings. The Marshall County meeting was held out at a rural church, black church, no surprise. And I don't know, there are 35 or 40 people in a pretty plain room, just bare light bulb, again, at night. People did work. That was time that was possible. I drove a bunch of people from the college campus out. And as we were gathered, and they were trying to go through this issue of particularly seeing who wants to go from here to the district meeting, the police cars arrived outside, I don't know, half a dozen of them, and came in toward the parking lot with their lights on, sort of in visual terms surrounding the parking lot. A moment of real risk. There had been occasions when they just came in and busted up meetings like this or threw tear gas in. They didn't in this case, partly because they knew perhaps there were a couple of us whites in that room. But meeting over, we went out and they tailed me close all the way back to Holly Springs, but they never stopped. And again, they were stopping anybody who drove for the freedom effort for, busted taillights or whatever at their whim. But in fact, we got home, Holly Springs, safe on that one. Didn't go to the district meetings, but then the statewide Freedom Democratic Party meeting was in Jackson, no surprise, state capital. And I drove a car full of people down who had been elected to go, plus another one of my colleagues who was teaching at Rust. And I realized going down that the engine was throwing oil. And it was a marvelous meeting, incredible. Ella Baker was there, Joe Rao, the famous lawyer for the UAW and a very prominent Washington figure, gave a terrific keynote. And you had this whole room in the model of the Democratic conventions you'd see on TV with the county signs and the delegations all across the floor. It was an incredible display of the energy and the courage that these blacks were showing in wanting to say, we want to be part of this democratic system we're supposed to have the benefit of. But I had to tell all the people who come with me, I can't get you back to Holly Springs. My engine's not reliable. So meeting over, it's dusk, heading into darkness, I bought a 6-pack of oil and started north. Every few miles I had to stop and put some more oil in because it was leaking so badly. And I was about 2/3 of the way back to Holly Springs. I think it was Batesville, I'm not sure, but I realized I had no more oil to add and it was just going to freeze. The engine was going to quit. And I came to a gas station diner and I literally coasted off the road into the parking slot alongside that diner. And I went in to find the payphone, which, an era when you still had payphones, because I'd gotten safe house numbers along the route from the right people to know if I got in trouble, here's who you could call. And so I went in and there's this row down the counter of the good old boys, including at least one in a police uniform. And the phone's right at the end of that. So I've got to call Robert Miles, was the safe house contact in that town, and try to explain to him, you want to come pick up this unknown to you white guy in the middle of the night. But he understood. We got it conducted enough that I understood he was coming. He came, picked me up, took me back to his house. Now, he was an extraordinary leader in the effort, and had been for some years, at trying to get the vote for the African-American citizens of Mississippi. His wife had fixed the little supper, and it was 10:30, pushing 11 o'clock by the time I got to the house. He and his son, over the next 2 nights, took turns sitting out on the porch toward the road with a shotgun. But their house had been fired into by night riders relatively soon before I got there. And I slept on a couch in the living room, below the line at the back of the couch. He arranged for the car to be taken to a black mechanic who had a very simple garage, just a regular ramshackly garage with a pit that you drove, or pushed the car over, and he could get under the engine to work on it. And he had a lift to deal with it. He replaced the head gasket over the next 2 days and got the car running again. I did manage to phone Jean and tell her what was going on, and try to be inconspicuous as much as I could in the black neighborhood while I watched and waited as he worked on the car, and got back to Holly Springs successfully.
You want to give us a lasting impression of your summer of '64 in Mississippi? Then?
Well, let me do a quick series, if I may. I'm sorry, I realize time's running here.
Sure.
There was an actual registration day. There were about 30 blacks who said, yes, I will go to the courthouse and try to get actually registered with the registrar. And so last week of the sequence that everybody, all the Northern volunteers were going to be there, a registration day was arranged for. They were to be caucused down at a black church about 3 blocks off the town square. The town square had 3 sides that were not prohibited to blacks, and then stores on the 4th side blacks could patronize. When my wife went to try to buy something in one of the white side stores, at 5 and dime or whatever, they just wouldn't wait on her. They knew who she was, one of these strangers, invaders, whatever. Well, the ground rules that the local police at all required is that the people come up from that church only 3 at a time and 10 feet apart. So those of us who were helping with the process decided we would intersperse 3 of us, so that 6 people would come up, including the 3 potential registrants, 3 blocks up, and they would make a turn down the sidewalk to the courthouse. The sidewalk was lined by the good old boys who taunted, jeered, said, I know where your mama works, I can cut your mortgage at the bank. Serious threats. The consequences could be real, and yet I think roughly 30 of those citizens had been persuaded to go through this ordeal, face the risks, and try to satisfy the registrar to get registered. We did not hear what the actual outcome of that was during the time we were there. We left before any results were presented. But the image of those brave people, some of them very simple rural folk, but they knew they wanted to vote, and this was a step in that direction, and they took the risk. That's one image that day. I just say in the background, I had cased the square earlier that morning, and there were local police, county sheriffs, state police, and then there was a whole truckload of, I don't know, 15 or 20 not volunteer, but temporary marshals had been appointed. And every one of them had an axe handle or a club, and they were just a little bit off the square. So they were ready for really serious beating up on people if it came to that. It didn't. They messed with the communications. It was walkie-talkies to try to coordinate from the church up to the square. And somebody started jamming those. And there was FBI was on the square also. We went to the FBI guy and said, well, you got to cut out this communication stuff or else you may get some trouble. It wouldn't make a move. One image, actual registration day.
One more, Deb.
The next image is Robert Miles, the guy who took me into his house on the road trip north from Jackson. He was elected at the state convention to go to Atlantic City, where the Democratic actual nominating convention was held that year, to renominate Lyndon Johnson. And he was part of that delegation. And there's a longer story than I can possibly give you now about the struggle they got to be recognized. But in the end, the Lily White delegation walked out of the convention And the Mississippi Freedom Democrats got enough credentials from other liberal attenders that they came in and sat in the seats of the Mississippi contingent. And there was Robert Miles. By that time, we were back in, not only in New Haven, we were back in Maine at our family summer place on the lake here, but we had a TV and I was watching. And there was Robert Miles in the seats on the floor of that convention. One more quickie to just bring a certain sense of conclusion. At least 20 years later, I got to know David Kennedy, who was a Yale Law School classmate of both Bill and Hillary Clinton. And he became a lawyer for Clinton for the non-official stuff, which there was, as you'll recall, some amount. Rather than the White House appointed lawyer, he was a private lawyer. He worked for one of the top firms in Washington. He was also a Quaker, and he was actually on the board and chaired the board of the Sidwell Friends School, the Quaker school in Washington, when I was on the board. So I'd gotten to know him. I didn't know that he had been in Mississippi in the summer of '64. Only when I got a Christmas message, because I sent him a Christmas letter, that he sent me his Christmas letter. And he talked about taking his teenage son back to Mississippi to see the places where David had spent the summer of '64, including Holly Springs. And what he described on that central Faulknerian landscape, central square with the courthouse in Holly Springs, was a memorial to the first elected Black sheriff of Marshall County. The Voting Rights Bill of 1965 had brought a revolution in actual voting by Blacks in Mississippi. And I think it's true still now, after the fullness of implementation of that over the years. There are more elected Black officials in Mississippi than in any other state. Not that the problems are over, not that the effort to purge Black voting and obstruct Black voting, and all of that's still around. But there was something just powerfully moving, still brings tears to my eyes to know what we had gone through, what the locals had gone through in the summer of '64, that they got enough of the power to vote that the Black majority in that county could elect their own sheriff and replace the one we knew as Flick Ash, who had supported the Klan and all the other good stuff. Enough.
Thanks, Dad. I love you. So proud
Oh,
of you.
thanks, Tom.
Hold on a second. Let me pin you.
Okay.
All right, go ahead. Do anything.
Well, time pressed and I just didn't get it in, but I would like to share a quote from Bill Coffin that I just found again this past week, but it stays with me, and it's a comment on faith. Bill said, "I love the recklessness of faith. First you leap, then you learn how to grow wings."
That was perfect, Dad. Awesome. Let me stop